Good day, everybody, and welcome to this podcast of the LGB Alliance Switzerland. Today we have a very special guest. We have Ella Whelan. She is an author. She regularly writes for Spiked. She also writes for The Telegraph, and she is one of the organisers of the yearly Battle of Ideas Festival, which takes place in London, Saturday, Sunday, usually in October, and it's a great festival of debate and discussion. Welcome, Ella.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Pleasure. We're here to talk about feminism. Now, one of the crucial things about feminism you notice these days is that when you talk about it, many people kind of deride it. And they say that feminism has become way too toxic and that it is actually something which is against men. And that is the problem with it. So feminists hate men. That's kind of the accusation. What's your response to that?
Well, the interesting thing about contemporary feminism, and I mean sort of that from sort of the late 90s onwards, maybe sort of 2000s onwards, is that to me anyway, it's completely different from any other iteration of feminism. And if you want to find real man-hating feminism, there was a lot of that in the sort of early stages. You might argue in some respects for fairly good reason. You know, a lot of the radical lesbian feminism, women genuinely having conferences in which they would come to the conclusion that it would be better to live absolutely separately from men in all respects. So it's not like that's a new thing, but the issue today is that there is a level of sort of blaming toxic masculinity, or anything a man does, for all the ills that women face. And rather than it being, 1950s with social norms being completely sexist, it's 2025 in which sexism is not just not a social norm, it's abhorrent. I mean, it's actually in some respects illegal, which is a whole different conversation. But the idea that the sort of the norm is men are awful to women, and so feminism has to correct that, doesn't reflect reality. But the interesting thing is there are still many ways in which women could do with a political movement centered around their needs and resources or lack of resources. Things like policies relating to childcare, laws relating to abortion. There are things that I think need to change in order to make women truly free. But contemporary feminism isn't really interested in any of that stuff. What it is interested in is predominantly the views and desires of probably professional middle class women who like to get a little bit of a gloss for saying, oh yeah, all men are awful, but really want to utilize the kind of feminist politics to get a bigger BBC salary or make it to the CEO board, or these kind of things. I might sound quite cynical, but I think that's predominantly what feminism has become, a tool of the middle classes rather than anything interesting for your average woman.
Yeah. So what I'm kind of hearing is there's a class issue involved, and there's also this kernel of truth in there, which is that feminism seems to have divorced itself from actually promoting the interests of women to something which is focused on toxic masculinity. And of course, what they consider toxic are often very good traits. I mean, we were at the Battle of Ideas at the debate where it was said that certain toxic feminists, if you like, consider courage and steadfastness and traditional virtues to be a form of toxic masculinity. So it's not difficult to come to the conclusion, if you take the terminology of these feminists, that feminism now is anti-male. And one of the, maybe perhaps you can talk about it because you are British, but it was also heavily publicized in the Swiss media. Someone called it a documentary, but it's actually a film or a series of little short episodes, Adolescence it's called, kind of series. Can you talk about that, how that fits into the picture?
Yeah, it was just a really good example of where people are at with the discussion about masculinity. So this Netflix series Adolescence, which is, follows the story of a young boy who becomes radicalized online and eventually does terrible things. I won't spoil it for anyone who's not seen it, but it's the whole idea of inceldom, the manosphere, the dangers of the online world for young men, and how, or Andrew Tate kind of phenomenon, all of that, and how young men are becoming toxic to the point of extreme violence, and horrific acts against women, and it it was well, one, the series itself was by some people seen as sort of controversial because it was loosely based on a case, and in actual fact they changed the ethnicity of it was a white boy in adolescence. The real story wasn't a white boy, and so there was lots of sort of suspicious, just kind of dodgy things that had happened with it, and it to me anyway, it felt like an extremely manipulated piece of entertainment that was trying to tap into a sort of moral panic about boys, and successfully did, and I think has had a really detrimental effect in terms of, you had Prime Minister, the Labour Party runs the government here in the UK, suggesting that this should be shown in all schools. The idea that you would give a lesson to all boys to say you are in danger of becoming monsters. The program makes, is this child becomes a monster. That's a terrible idea. That's a terrible idea, to go in and tell boys that, untouched by expertise or unmanipulated by their teachers and consent classes and whatever else it is, that they will turn into animals and rapists and all the rest of it. And it's just such a misanthropic and misunderstood view of what's going on with boys. I mean, the interesting thing about masculinity from a woman's perspective is that I don't think, really, if everybody's honest about it, that most women have a dislike of masculinity. And I don't just mean, courage, steadfastness, all the positive stuff, but, all the other stuff, the kind of manliness, gruffness, aggressiveness, not violent, mean aggressiveness, but put it this way, most women, heterosexual women anyway, I think probably want to be approached by a man at the bar rather than the other way around. There are still some kind of norms and realities in the relationship between the sexes, which mean that most of us like a man's man, and most women have a sense of what kind of particularly in relation to a man, what kind of woman you want to be. You want to be the woman, they be the man. You have a relationship. It works, kind of, and that's not to say that then you stick to your boxes and it's very limiting, but there is a kind of reality to this that I think most people don't deny. But then, so that it's very hard for boys at the moment, I think, because there's that reality, which is you need to be the one that asks a girl out, you need to be the one that pays for the date and blah, blah, blah. But also you need to be the opposite. You can't do any of those things because you can't be toxically masculine. And I genuinely think young guys now don't have a clue of what to do. They do not have they're terrified anyway. The whole idea of young men being sort of these rapacious, predatory animals. If you've ever met a teenage boy, you know that is absolutely not true. Teenage girls are terrifyingly confident. Fantastic. I think that's great. But they are terrifyingly confident. Boys mostly are just terrified. And so, I just think there's this lie, there's a kind of falsehood about what really is going on with young people. And instead you have adults panicking and trying to manipulate what they think young people should be doing rather than actually just letting them get on with it. So I think the masculinity thing is so interesting, but it's also, it's to use the toxic word, it's toxic in itself, because I think it's really warping young people's sense of themselves, particularly boys.
That's very interesting, because on the one hand, you're saying that women normally, in the big picture, like a man's man. On the other hand, when you look at boys, for instance, the narrative which is spun about them, that they're all toxically masculine and need to be educated out of it, kind of, through these films and so on, and other kinds of educational material and stuff. You would assume that that might lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it actually doesn't, because on the one hand, they are scared and insecure. That doesn't sound terribly toxically masculine to me.
Mm.
And on the other hand, they are scared in a very real sense. I mean, I speak to men who are heterosexual, and they're scared of approaching women because they fear to be Me Too'd, the whole Me Too scandal. So maybe you could talk about more about how men, are, about what your perception of men is, that they're not toxically masculine, but that there's something else going on. And maybe also thematize what happened during Me Too and what your thoughts on Me Too are, which features heavily in the discussion.
Mm. Well, I think it's important to just say from the get-go that I don't think the solution to any of this is to suddenly go all bleeding heart for men, which is very tempting, and do a kind of victim politics for men, which some people do. And I just, as in the same way that I think victim politics in terms of feminism and women is useless and detrimental to women's liberation, I think that it would be terrible for men to try and copy that politics by saying, oh, poor me, pity me. Because, to come back to the class issue, I think there is large sections of society who none of this particularly touches, and they just kind of get on with it. And, I don't want to caricature working class society or culture. I'm not trying to paint a ridiculously rosy picture of it, but I think there's a lot, put it this way, relationships between the sexes are slightly more relaxed. And I think probably that's because people are more in it together, and particularly working class families, there's less of this sense of tension between the sexes. So there's the class element, but in terms of the tensions that do exist between the way in which we talk about men and women, girls and boys, I do think Me Too has had quite an impact. So this was way back in 2017, 2018, I think. You had the sort of scandal broke that this Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein was a horror, and various celebrities decided to tweet about it, and they said, wouldn't it be great if every woman who had ever been wronged by a man tweeted saying "Me Too" and their story, and then we would, the idea is we would see the normalcy of sexual harassment. And in some ways there's being able to talk about things that happen to you is always a good thing. I'm a free speech absolutist, and I think that you shouldn't bottle anything away. And I very much support the idea that when someone does something wrong, you call them out on it, no matter the consequences. So the kind of let's talk aspect I admired, but what happened was you've had women worldwide conflating the kinds of things that was alleged against Harvey Weinstein, which was extremely serious, rape, violent assault, the very most extremes of crimes that can be committed against women, conflating that kind of behavior with bad dates, bad jokes, uncomfortable behavior, none of which is to be celebrated, but it is not the same as wantonly and willingly destroying a woman's autonomy by attacking her. And, there's a number of examples of men who were brought down on the back of allegations which were never going to get a fair trial because it's sort of trial by social media. In particular, there was one example here in the UK of a journalist who, on the basis of, he was sort of a writer on the basis of a bad date that he'd had. When you read the story, you thought, oh God, you're just a bit of a lame jerk, like you shouldn't be sent to jail, but you might want to work on your game a bit. But, because this woman had done this takedown of him and had her particular view of what had happened, he was destroyed. He was absolutely destroyed, excommunicated from his, admittedly sort of very liberal lefty circles, and he should have known that was going to happen. But people, it really set up this tension, which is two people can go on a date. Two people can have completely different views of what happens, which happens, you think you've done really, really well and the other person goes home hating you. That's the kind of reality of life. But that it wouldn't just end there with a sort of, no, thank you, I don't want to see you again. But that instead you could be publicly shamed. This is the difficult post-Me Too world we live in. I'm all for public shaming when it's warranted. And if there's some jerk out there who's repeatedly treating women badly, then a bit of public shaming might make him change his behaviour. But instead, we've ended up with Margaret Atwood, the author of The Handmaid's Tale, did a really great essay, which she actually got half cancelled for, in which she said, we are moving into sort of puritanical territory here, where nobody can make any mistakes. And if you can't make any mistakes, you can't fall in love, you can't have sex, you can't do it, you can't take any risk worth taking, has the potential for huge mistakes. So it's pretty, I think the post-Me Too world is nervous, it's anxious, to use that terrible word, but it's for genuine reason, because who would go dating now with the fact that your entire date, sentence by sentence, kiss by kiss, could be put online and scrutinized by millions of strangers? It's horrific.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of, if you can't do anything wrong, then you can't do anything right. So you're kind of in a conundrum. And if we come back to feminism, because there's quite a foundational critique here that you have of it. So I guess the question would be, in what fundamental ways has modern feminism, which we see around us all day long, every day, gone wrong? How has it betrayed women?
I think there's one really key way in which feminism is not just no longer not serving women, but becoming a barrier in itself to women's liberation. And that is a focus on safetyism and a focus on not sort of the practicalities necessarily of being safe, but feeling safe. And what do women need to feel safe? And if you look at previous, the history of feminism and previous campaigns or moments in which feminists came together to do something, there was a much more robust sense of an sort of indignant demand for the right to be, for freedom. A really great example of this is, when the murderer known as Jack the Ripper was killing women, and you had the official line from the media saying these women kind of deserved it because lots of them were prostitutes. You had a huge lack of sympathy in the public because of what these women did, and even in some cases, many of them weren't prostitutes. They just had the audacity to go out on a Friday night. There was, talk about toxic. A terrible time, and a genuine life-threatening fear that if you went out, you might be the next victim because he hadn't been caught. And instead of saying, "Oh, of course, we'll stay at home in our buttoned-up nightgowns and we won't dare to go anywhere," and basically give in to the fear that this individual was trying to create, women launched Take Back the Night campaigns where they insisted that they would go out and that they would not go under curfew and that they would not do what they were told because freedom was more important, and that they refused to be cowed. And that was an incredibly powerful message around the balance of risk and freedom and safety and, the what happens if you give into a kind of culture of fear. And you fast forward then to, a contemporary example. A few years ago, there was a murder of a woman called Sarah Everard, who was walking home from I think it was from work. Anyway, she was walking at late at night. Well, it wasn't even that late, and was kidnapped and murdered and all sorts by a police officer called Wayne Couzens. And in the wake of this horrific event, there was a huge, massive, wide-scale discussion about how dangerous it was for women to go out at night, how, they had people suggesting that we should have special apps on our phones that our parents could track us. I mean, Jesus, that you should have to check in with your friend, all this stuff, that women should be policed. And, number one, that he was one specific guy, a very specific case of police failure, actually, but not representative of a real threat to women. And also, instead of a public outcry and demand for women's freedom, there was a total resignation into the idea that we should act like children, that we should be protected like children. And so I just think there's a shift in the way in which women. There's a shift in the way in which feminism sees women's role in society. Now we're seen as women to be protected rather than free women who should be doing everything they can to demand their freedom. We've kind of, I think feminism has kind of given up and given in to the idea that we are weaker and more vulnerable than men. I mean, obviously there's a physical reality which no one can deny, which is, most women are going to be physically overpowered by men, and let's not be silly about it. I'm not trying to deny reality, but politically, I'm not weaker. My rights shouldn't be weaker. My freedoms shouldn't be weaker. My sense of self shouldn't be weaker. And so I think the main problem I have is not that feminism exists. I want a women's liberation movement to exist. It's not that people, it's not that we shouldn't talk about violence against women. I want to talk about it. I think it's very important. Most importantly is that it doesn't happen with strangers. It happens in a domestic setting. But it's that I want to talk about this in terms of how do we demand that we get our freedom back and keep it rather than giving it up for a sense of safety and protection.
Yeah, that's interesting that feminism actually used to be for the promotion of freedom, to, ascertain, to attain equal rights for women. And now you have these restrictions, which you just talked about. I seem to remember because if you think about how women are treated as children, infantilized, one of the examples that comes to mind is, was it Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, who kind of banned certain adverts on the tube, which showed women in skimpy dress. And his reasoning was kind of that was kind of sexist. And you had quite good arguments on that, against that kind of prohibition or censorship of those adverts. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, it was a very funny time. I mean, aside from the discussion about, serious discussion about violence against women and a lot of the discussion about women's freedom and safety ends up there. But actually there's sort of there's a plethora of examples in which the whole concept of women's safety has expanded far beyond a sort of basic sort of will you be knifed, will you be murdered, will you be raped question into how safe mentally do you feel, how safe emotionally do you feel. And this campaign on TfL, on Transport for London and the Underground, was a really good example of it. So there were these adverts that were advertising weight loss powder, and the weight loss powder was being advertised by a slim woman in a bikini, and it said something like, are you bikini body ready? And there was this, protest by a few women, I think it was 3 women who, quite successfully made a headway on social media, posing in their bikinis, and they were all good-looking, normal women, not tiny models, posing, saying, I say that I am Beachbody ready. Fair enough. What wasn't fair enough was that Sadiq Khan, London mayor, steps in and says, okay, these women were calling for the posters to be taken down, but whatever, you can have your protest. But Sadiq Khan said, okay, we're going to take these posters down because women getting the tube are being emotionally, psychologically harassed by these images, and having the question, are you bikini body ready, is so damaging to women that we have to take it down. And it was, much applauded how absolutely wonderful it was, that it was, so progressive. And I couldn't believe it, because I thought, we're celebrating the idea that women need to have images shielded from them in order to not upset them. The idea is that women are walking around so insecure about their bodies and so insecure about themselves that, oh dear, the picture of a size 8, in a bikini is just too much for us to handle, is so insulting. It's incredibly insulting. But this is the world we live in, which is, the idea that it's a good thing to celebrate your fragility. That you would say, well, no, I do find it very hard, and actually, it does make me feel really bad. So the world has to reflect my fragility and has to compensate for me. And yes, please do take down all of these images, otherwise I won't be able to handle my commuter journey. I just think that women should be so angry about that characterization of our confidence and our intelligence, because we all have our up days and our down days. And you sometimes you think I'm not suggesting that advertising doesn't work. It works for a reason. I'm sure lots of people did look at that and think, oh God, and go and buy the powder. but to create a blanket ban in order to protect women's sense of self is disgustingly paternalistic by Sadiq Khan, and is the kind of thing that I would have hoped our mothers and grandmothers used to spit at. The idea that a man would have to do something like that for you, to me, it's just an anathema to everything that a progressive women's politics should be about.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I mean, if we come on to the subject maybe of trans for a minute, because it's the same in kind of, I mean, we're from LGB Alliance Switzerland, and here you also have hate speech laws, as you might call them in English, where, race, religion, and sexual orientation are protected. Interestingly, in Switzerland, sex is not protected. Neither is, fashionable trans identities. That's not protected. So, and we just recently had a case, of a guy in Switzerland who posted something on Facebook. His name is Emanuel Brünis-Holz. He's just a repairman. I mean, so they're picking on very weak people who don't have much money and so on. He's a repairman of wind instruments in the canton of Bern in Burgdorf, and he wrote on Facebook the following comment: if you dig up LGBTQI people after 200 years, all you'll find, according to the skeletons analyzed, is men and women. Everything else is a psychological illness promoted through the curriculum, end quote. That's all he said. And now he's facing 10 days in jail in Switzerland for incitement and hate and discrimination under those hate speech laws against LGBTQ people, or sexual orientation in this case. And it's really concerning, because that also kind of assumes that gay people need to be protected, homosexuals, from these remarks which, are very hurtful to us. And so, as delicate wallflowers, we need the state to step in to protect our feelings. Otherwise, we might crumble. So there's a great parallelism there. But on the subject of trans as well, I mean, women have a real problem with this. I mean, you have men dressing up as women, pretending that being a woman is just having a wig and some high heels and makeup, and then they try to get into women's bathrooms. A huge assault on women's rights. And as you can probably, I mean, you know this, right? Feminists these days, self-described feminists, are all in for it. They love this kind of trans stuff. So maybe you could expostulate a bit more about that.
Well, I think some feminists like this trans stuff, and then there's been really interesting to watch the split happen, because for a very long time, in from the 2000s onwards, feminism was the flavour of the month for any politician. And in the UK we had Ed Miliband and people wearing "this is what a feminist looks like" t-shirts, and they'd be like promoting no more page 3 campaigns, and having women only caucuses, women only awards, women only roles in parliament, all these kind of things, was the idea that very much women are different to men. Women need, and feminist politics said, women need special treatment, positive discrimination, all these things. And then the kind of trans thing happens, and boom, that all is gone. The whole concept of the whole idea of women and men being different, and as feminists would have argued, needing different things, that just disappears. And you have sort of half feminists, I suppose the ones that are radical feminists, the ones that are called TERFs, some of them like that label, some of them don't, trans exclusionary radical feminists, who say, no, sex is a reality. You can't do this. We're not allowing men in our spaces. And then there's the other half that you're sort of alluding to, for whom their support for feminism or anything else was always it was always based on a sort of virtue signaling idea of what was popular at the time. And so then trans becomes popular. And so then it becomes the done thing to say, oh, of course I'm inclusive. Of course trans women are women, despite the fact that it absolutely contradicts the thing that you thought yesterday about women being specific and needing a specific kind of politics. So there was just a kind of a lie, I think, and just a really obvious and cynical kind of destruction of principles for the people who have got on the trans bandwagon. But the other interesting thing, for me anyway, as someone who was always critical of feminism, has been, for the trans thing is to sort of, you almost had to kind of get back to basics. And actually we weren't really arguing anymore, even about Me Too or things like that, because you suddenly had to argue that a woman was the very basic, that a woman was a woman and a man was a man. And no, a man could not come into a women's changing room in a swimming pool in which teenagers were getting dressed. You're like, what? But this was kind of daily reality post the sort of trans ideology explosion. And you had to come back to basics of saying, no, I think it's terrible that lots of young girls are expressing a disgust with their body and a desire to cut bits off. That's wrong. That's not trans joy. That's self-mutilation of young people. So you had to everything just got stripped back to a real hard basic in a way and it's unfathomable that it's been this difficult and taken this long for the tide to start to just about, I think, start to change back to some sense of normality in all of this. So the kind of all the feminists, I guess, anyway, all of the criticisms I had kind of took a backseat, because I thought this is just the most important thing now, is to win this fight for common sense and for women's rights and for to push back on the real nihilism that I think a lot of trans ideology expresses. But now that sort of things are slightly starting to change. I mean, there have been, the Tavistock, which was a gender identity clinic here in the UK, got shut down because of, finally, after so many complaints about the ill treatment of children turning up saying that they wanted to be trans. And, you've had reports saying, bringing to light some of the inadequacies around the sort of medical side to all of this. And, a Supreme Court ruling, saying, yes, women are women and all the rest of it. So there's been some, I'm not suggesting the war is over. It's not. The battle isn't even won in many cases, but there is a little bit of room. And I think now it's probably useful to start to think about what a future women's politics would be. Because the interesting thing about, a criticism of the trans movement from many feminists, one, it was very much based on the idea that a man shouldn't come into a woman's bathroom because men are dangerous. And here we come back to what we began this discussion talking about. Instead of just, you can't come in because you're a man and I want to put my lipstick on in private. And, we just have different spaces. It's not that I'm afraid of you. It's just, I don't want you here. It's like not a life or death thing. It's a mundane I don't want you here thing. And that should be enough of an explanation. So for me, there was a problem with the kind of ramping up of danger around men, because actually there are most areas of public life I have no problem with men being in, just not my toilet stall. But most other areas, I love men being there. So there was that kind of thing. But then I think also there was, and this has been expressed in the kind of, increase in discussions around surrogacy or prostitution or even abortion, actually, that men and women should be solely defined by their biological functions. And there's been a little bit of creeping biological determinism in all of this, which is that, what does it mean to be a woman? Well, it's not just long hair and pretty nails, which, some trans women seem to believe it is, but it's also not just making babies and periods. It's I think that there's been a dumbing down of the whole concept of what men and women are for necessary reasons, but I would like that to go no further. I want to reinstate some kind of sense that, there are stereotypes of men and women that I don't want to return to just because we've had to fight on this very basic idea of sex realism. So I'm interested in starting to pick a few more fights now and maybe make myself a little bit unpopular in some circles by saying I'll stand with you to the day I die on the issue of trans ideology and its problems, but I might start to disagree with you on the future of women's politics, because I think one thing I really don't want is for the norm to now become a sort of fearful feminist politics, which I think in some cases there is a danger of it happening.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things there. There's on the thing we'll come back to is the biological determinism, which is very interesting, where you have female brains and male brains and the wrong body and all that kind of thing. But then, I mean, that must lead to some quite interesting discussions, because you haven't, I mean, as you were alluding to, you want to be more, contradictory, not for the sake of it, but because you actually believe these things, and certain people on your side disagree with you anyway on those things, and you want to voice those differences. But if you must have had these conversations already with certain people on your side, our side, where they say women are inherently in danger or endangered by men, but you've actually contradicted that and saying, no, actually, it's just a stay out of our spaces thing. So one of the interesting questions there is, how do those conversations go? You must have had some very interesting conversations. And I suppose, is there a danger perhaps that our movement is not as tolerant as it purports to be?
Well, not to do a sort of self-publicising thing, but at the Battle of Lisbon Festival, which you mentioned in your opening introduction for me, this year we held a discussion called Damsels in Distress, what's going on with women's safety. And I was speaking on the panel, which is unusual because I usually chair, but we had a great panel of women with different perspectives on this very issue. And we had a real fight, and I really enjoyed it. And the audience, who were, I think it's probably fair to say, quite a large number of gender critical women, really didn't like what I had to say about trying to reject a culture of safetyism and a culture of fear in women's politics. And I think the very difficult thing is, how does it come across when you say, no, we shouldn't be scared? Because, of course, anybody can come up with, the reality is that there are scary things out there. Too many women are killed by their partners at home every year. It's, this is a thing that really does happen. Why it happens and how you would stop it is a huge conversation, but it's a thing that happens. It's also a reality that most young women will have at some point in their life had some kind of at the very least uncomfortable interaction with a man, whether that's someone being a bit pervy on the train, someone pushing their luck or things like that. And it's an experience that most men don't have. Most men don't, think about themselves like that. Men might fear things like getting beaten up after a football match or in a pub or where there's been lots of drinking, things that I wouldn't be scared of. But the whole idea of fear of sexual harassment or fear of yourself as a woman and a man doing something to you, it's not an experience that men have. So that's a reality. I don't want to pretend that's not reality. My argument is, so what do we do with that? Do we then say the solution is a culture of fear in which you, and I think there are lots of feminists and other people guilty of this, hype up the danger that women face. So, for example, in this discussion we had at the Battle of Ideas Festival, I said lots of this discussion takes place around women on university campuses in this country, in the UK, are probably the safest place you can possibly ever be. And there was, huge disgust from the audience. You think, what? What? They are. I mean, they are statistically, they are on a sort of reality basis. They are, if you go there, they're really boring. Campuses are really boring these days. So, like, God, I wish women were having more casual sex on campus. But there's, that's an expression of a sort of a ramping up of a culture of fear that says you must always, always be afraid because if something happened. And what that does is it makes women who are afraid don't take risks. And that, I think that's a problem. And I come back to this wonderful, probably overquoted line from Camille Paglia, the American, feminist thinker, writer, philosopher and political activist, she said, when she was at university, and there was proper paternalistic rules where women were not allowed to have men in their room alone. Women had to have, it was called 1 foot on the floor and the door open or something like that. So you had to, you couldn't be in bed with them. You had to have the door open. Women were under curfew. Men in the men's dorms were sex segregated. In the men's dorms, no problem. Come and go as you like. Bring who you want in. Women's dorms, very much like living at home with your mum and dad breathing down your neck. And her and other women campaigned to remove all those paternalist laws because she said, I want the freedom to risk rape. Meaning, if I take the risk to have free and open sexual encounters on my terms, maybe drunk, maybe not, there is going to be this risk that something bad will happen to me. But I prefer weighing up my options, that I have the freedom with this risk, rather than have no freedom, no risk, but no fun. And I think that for me, it's saying there is a reality that women face. It's not as nearly as bad as it used to be, but it could be better. And how do we move to a future in which women don't have to look over their shoulders? And I think telling them that they have to look over their shoulders when they don't need to is not the way to go. The way to go is to say, let's be sensible. Let's not do anything silly. I'm not suggesting anyone put themselves in any kind of irresponsible danger, but politically, can we start arguing that freedom is more important than safety?
Yeah. I suppose that phrase from Camille Paglia, give me the freedom to risk rape, or I want that freedom, that's pretty powerful. And that's the point. It's a freedom. There's a certain sense of uncertainty involved, or a degree of it. But if you believe that men are hardwired to be a risk to women, then it's certain you will get raped, and you're not free to get raped. You will necessarily be raped at some point. And if you have these kind of, this is the biological narrative, which I actually oppose very much, because I don't think the human, this is also freedom, the thing you said. If we're free beings, then the biological stuff does not determine our actions. So there's always this, at least there's free will, which kind of inhibits the biological desires or whatever impulses or instincts you have or you might feel. And that's why we hold people responsible for rape, because my brain made me do it isn't a good excuse, if you're standing in front of the judge and so on. So, yeah, could you speak about that? Because there's also this female brain stuff and so on. And it's really annoying, because we should have gotten past this. It is a very, let me say it, it's a 1930s kind of view. It's kind of the social Darwinism stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it really is a return to a very reactionary past, which saw men and women as being, the balance of free will and autonomy and free thinking are completely outweighed by a sense of just biological drive. And look, I want to be fair. When you've got a situation in which, for example, the NHS here in the UK, National Health Service, is in some departments, in some cases, briefing staff to use the term chest feeders, and say pregnant people instead of pregnant women, and all this reflection of the idea that men, a male, a sort of, a gender neutral, or in some cases even just male language can come and infect what is a women's thing, pregnancy and childbirth and all the rest of it. I understand why then there is a sort of a retort to say, no, we are women, we have babies, this is our thing. I understand that. I felt it myself when I was pregnant with my kids, but that's not all we are. And there is this, number one, not all women do that and go down that route. But also, it used to be the case that women were only seen as not just child rearers, but caregivers, the soft ones. The fact that there's lots of downsides to the femininity, that you're naturally more predilected towards conflict resolution. And as someone who's loves conflict, that I've never been able to match that up at all. I hate resolution. I love to be in arguments all the time. But there's, it's just such a narrow, reductive view of men and women. And for women, it's annoying. For men, it's dangerous, because no one's telling me that I'm naturally going to become an assailant. But that, I think, that is what we're in some cases sort of alluding to with young men, that unless they train their monkey brains, their male monkey brains, into absolutely being focused on not raping this girl you're taking on a date, then somehow he'll just fall into doing it, that his sort of muscle memory will become awful, will become immoral. And that's just not true. It's such a, I just keep coming back to the idea that it's such a misanthropic view of human potential and human sociability, and the fact that we're social beings and that we're not. It's just this idea that we're these sort of monkeys on this one set track, very self-obsessed, very isolated, very immoral, and I don't think that's true at all. So there's in the face of sort of trans nuts ideology, I think we're starting to reheat some of the very old, do I want to say gender stereotypes? Possibly, gender stereotypes that used to really, that we used to say we need to defeat, and feminists in the past used to say we need to defeat. That's, and I think that there are, the more I think about it, the more I think there are lots of lessons that can be learnt from older generations of women, my mother's generation, my grandmother's generation, who just had a much greater sense of what they wanted from the world and how to get it. Rather than now, I think there's a lot of theorizing and a lot of self-reflection and a lot of narcissism, which is ending up in some weird and not so wonderful places.
That was actually going to be my next question, because one of the other things you see is that, if you think about whatever feminism might be, it should facilitate the healthy possibility of relationships being formed between men and women. But these days, if you want my own, I'm just going to say it. These days, a lot of kids, a lot of young people, teenagers and people in their early 20s are completely narcissistic. And one of the reasons for that, I suppose, is because if you do reduce them to these biological machines, you don't cultivate their higher moral faculties, but you don't expect them to be moral agents who can fall down and learn and need to be exposed to risk and all of that, but need to be hemmed in and controlled like you might control a machine, which is where social engineering comes from, which is what we're talking about with all these programs and so on. But in a sense, relationships are pretty shallow these days because you have people who haven't been not taught to do it, but haven't learned for themselves how to escape that kind of narcissism. And that's a real challenge because, that just makes everything pretty miserable. So what's your thoughts on that?
No, I would largely agree. I mean, I've got a really great example for you because there's just been an article written in Vogue magazine. I hazard a guess predominantly read by women, probably posher women, but anyway, Vogue magazine, and it's sort of gone viral, this article. It's about, the headline is something like, "Is it uncool to have a boyfriend?" Sounds really superficial and lame. It is really superficial, but the interesting thing about it, and part of the reason why it's gone viral, is that the whole argument is that the author of the article is arguing women have for too long been defined by their relationships with men. True, historically. You were, I would have been Mrs. Llewellyn, and that would have been it. I wouldn't even have ever been called Ella, probably, or you were the Mrs. or whatever. So yes, historically true. Not for a very long time, I'd argue, but historically true. And so what women should do now is embrace being single. And in actual fact, the author went as far as to say it was kind of, I think she uses the term vibes, which is a terrible term, but that it's uncool, it's unvibesy for women to be partnered up. And she said, I mute people on social media anytime it's revealed that they have a boyfriend. And you might think, oh, what a weird article, but I think it's expressing a trend, which is that the prospect of opening yourself up to a relationship with somebody else is too much for many young people because they have been told to obsess about their sense of self and their own identity. And if you are that narcissistic, a genuinely narcissistic, and which I think we're encouraging young people to be, then it's impossible and terrifying to think that you would invite someone into your world, because obviously entering into a relationship with someone of the opposite sex or the same sex, whatever, but entering into a romantic relationship means that you become scrutinized by a second party, and that's that's the risk. We're talking about risk and freedom. That's the risk, and also the risk is that it could all go wrong. And I think we're telling young people that, particularly women and particularly young girls and boys, that the conditions for everything, for you to do anything, always have to be perfect and secure and risk-free. And I think this is particularly the case with young women and men's relationships, that you can't do anything that you don't know is going to turn out perfectly, which means you can't do anything, because you never know. You never know how that first kiss is going to go until you do it. And if you ask to do it, it ruins it. There's a reality to romance, which is that it's all, there's a reason why we talk about the spark, right? You see, you can't manage it. And I think we're giving young men and women an unrealistic view of what romantic life might be. And so they're turning into what this article is describing, these monsters who just want to live. I mean, it's not monstrous to live an isolated life. I know there's people who enjoy it, but the idea that you would shut yourself off from a romantic life because it ruined your identity or it sort of didn't look good on social media is horrific. But I think it's expressing just this aversion. This aversion. You can see it with the falling birth rate. You can see it with any of the many reports recently that say that Gen Z don't like dating, they don't really like sex, they don't really like drinking, they don't really like everything that I was desperate to do by the age of 14 or 15. And it's because it's all these behaviours and activities are risky. And I think young people today have been told risk is terrible, avoid risk at all costs. And I feel really bad for them, because all of the things that I've ever done in my life that are good and I've enjoyed have been risky. Some of them turned out badly. Many of them have turned out well, whether that's falling in love, getting married, having children, starting a career, whatever it is. So I just think probably the solution to all of this, whether it's feminism, whether it's young people, whether it's relationships between the sexes, is to say we need to get the idea that risk is a dirty word reversed, and actually say that risk is a really important part of freedom. It's a really important part of autonomy. It's a really important part of adult life. Just being an adult, means that you cannot manage the future in this minute way.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose it's interesting because in the gay sphere you have a similar problem. If you think about human beings and their nature, we do require some sort of love or relationship. We are social beings to a certain extent. And so if you fear that kind of deep connection with someone because it might expose you to risk and you don't really engage in it, you fail to really develop your personality. And what you then have, instead of a deep relationship with one person, or maybe two or something, which is, pretty consistent throughout time, you have an endless succession of strangers, faceless strangers almost, with whom you sleep. And that is kind of not treating other people in a very respectful manner, I would say. It's like tissue paper. You blow your nose and you throw one away, you take the next one, you blow it again, and so on. And I think that has a very detrimental impact on both parties involved. For the one that is kind of rejected from being let into the other person's world, and the other person who isn't developing his world to a state of quite considerable maturity by, being very human and, learning how to be human with someone. So they can always be very good in the first few moments, but then they kind of have their failures come out and they don't want to be exposed to the risk of being rejected because of them, or it's very uncomfortable because they might have to improve themselves, and then they just move on to the next person and the same process begins again and again. That's a very problematic thing. I guess you see it that way too, in that kind of light, perhaps.
Well, I would probably differ from you in relation to I find myself at the moment almost to a ridiculous extent defending casual sex, because I think there's been such a puritanical turn against, whether it's Mary Harrington, Louise Perry, all these self-styled reactionary feminists who I just think are bores. I just think are stuffy, uptight Puritans who to explain, I think, hold the view that freedom makes you dirty, that freedom, human beings given freedom end up doing disgusting things, and we're all disgusting and damaged because we live in a porn sick society, as they like to say. I don't buy that. And I think that if, you should sow your wild oats and you should have a good time and you should kiss lots of frogs before you find your prince or princess, because sex is a part of human life and it's a fun part of human life. But I think you make a really important point about what the maturity it takes to become committed to anything in your life, any project, whether it's the project of a relationship or raising children or sticking it out at a job that isn't quite what you thought it was going to be, and there is a very flighty attitude, I think. I sound like I'm really having a go at young people. I don't want to, and I hope I'm not, but there is this, I think there is this idea that, that you can just keep quitting. And actually anything good is worth sticking at. And, the talking about promoting risk, there's also an idea of promoting steadfastness.
Yeah. Well, personally, I sort of half agree with you because in my opinion, it should be, you find the good people and then you have lots of sex with them. And, if Mary Harrington finds that dirty, then, well, as you say, she's a bit of a stuck-up person who's a bit conservative and so on. Totally agree. Although, respect to her, she's also written some good work.
Mhm.
But the yeah, but the thing is, there's also this idea of reveling in pain. You see this with the climate movement, so they are making themselves miserable to a certain extent. But as you see in the climate movement with Greta Thunberg, they sort of derive pleasure from pain, which is a really interesting phenomenon. I can't really explain it quite. I don't know why that's happening. Um, but last point, I suppose, because you did allude at the beginning to. Because would you consider yourself a feminist? And what are the things women still need to achieve that are really important but no one's talking about?
I wouldn't call myself a feminist because I think that it has too many trappings in a contemporary sense of, what. I just think that it's too. I think it's been too bastardized, basically. So I don't call myself a feminist, but I'm very much. I'm a women's liberationist. I want to liberate women. I want to decriminalize abortion. I think that's a very, very important step worldwide, but I'll start with the UK in terms of solidifying the idea and championing the idea that women have moral autonomy and should be free to make decisions that determine their fate and their futures. So I think the whole concept of abortion law isn't just about a debate about pregnancy, the unborn, all the stuff that gets discussed in relation to abortion. It's for me anyway. I think it's fundamentally a question about how a society views women's ability to handle their own freedom. And at the moment, women are not free to make decisions about their future. And I think that's a great injustice. So I'd change abortion laws, decriminalize them. I would make some real changes in order to uh, free women from the remaining domestic drudgery that lots of us still have to do in terms of lots of us still find ourselves not quite trapped at home, but certainly ending up hanging over the washing machine. And a lot of that comes down to inadequate childcare provision, both the cost and the access to it. So any kind of progressive government, I think, should lay on loads of free childcare, not to funnel women back into the workplace, but just to give us the choice whether we want to or not. So I think that would be a simple thing. But I think probably most importantly, it's rekindling a sense of women's strength and not girl power in the sort of like Spice Girls way, but actually maybe the thing about some of these old '90s bands that I keep thinking about. You won't know this, Andrea, but the Sugar Babes, the Spice Girls, as much of the '90s sort of girl power stuff is derided as superficial and marketized and commercial and capitalist. But there was something to it, which is that, the idea of you're not going to tell me what to do. I'm a woman, I'm powerful. Hear me roar, all that kind of stuff might sound silly, but I think actually a politics that's based on women in a position of strength demanding freedom is sorely needed in order to convince particularly a young generation that they really don't have very much to fear and they have everything to gain.
Yes. For our Swiss audience, where can they follow you online?
So the best place to see any work I've done is mainly the Battle of Ideas Festival. So that's battleofideas.org.uk. And you can watch all of our previous debates. This year we did I've chaired discussions on the manosphere, on DEI, EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion, and all the sort of that kind of woke discussion. Let's put it that way. I chaired discussions on breastfeeding and bottle feeding and parenting and gentle parenting and all kinds of things. So the Battle of Ideas is a really good place to look. The website Spiked Online. I write in the Telegraph, and you can follow me on Twitter at Ella_M_Whelan. So yeah, look forward to continuing the discussion in many forms.
Well, Ella Whelan, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.